It was another chilly evening as the hospital lights flickered against the darkening sky. Dr. Andrew Lawson, a seasoned physician with a reputation for his sharp focus and unwavering dedication, noticed something strange on his way out. At the edge of the parking lot, near the emergency entrance, a small, scruffy puppy huddled on a tattered blanket. Its eyes glimmered with an unusual sadness, and its small body curled tightly as though warding off the cold. Andrew shook his head and walked to his car, dismissing the sight as another stray seeking shelter. But the next night, the puppy was there again, same spot, same lonely gaze. Andrew's curiosity was piqued. How could such a vulnerable creature survive these freezing nights? He couldn't shake the image from his mind, even as he tended to patients. By the third night, the puppy's presence had become impossible to ignore. He saw nurses offering scraps of food and a few visitors stopping to pet the little dog. But despite the kindness, the puppy never wandered far, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. Andrew decided to take a closer look. He crouched near the puppy, who flinched but didn't run. Its fur was matted, and it looked as though it hadn't eaten properly in days. "What are you doing here, buddy?" Andrew whispered, his voice soft but tinged with concern. The puppy's ears perked up slightly, but its eyes darted toward the hospital entrance, as if expecting a miracle to walk out the doors. Andrew glanced back, puzzled. By now, word had spread among the hospital staff. Some joked about the puppy being the new mascot, while others theorized it might belong to a homeless person. But Andrew wasn't convinced. There was an air of purpose about the puppy, a quiet determination in the way it refused to leave the spot. He began to wonder if there was more to this story than met the eye. That evening, Andrew stayed late, his curiosity outweighing his exhaustion. From the warmth of his office, he kept an eye on the parking lot. The puppy sat patiently, its tiny frame silhouetted against the hospital's glow. Hours passed, but it didn't budge. Finally, as the night deepened and the streets emptied, Andrew decided he needed answers. Grabbing his coat, he headed outside. He approached the puppy slowly, offering a piece of his sandwich. This time, it took the food but remained guarded. As he crouched beside it, Andrew noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, worn collar around its neck with a name tag that had faded over time. He could barely make out the name. Max's heart ached at the thought of the dog being abandoned. But why here? Why this hospital? Then, in the stillness of the night, Andrew spotted a faint movement in the distance. His pulse quickened as he turned to see a figure stumbling toward the hospital. The puppy immediately perked up, its tail wagging furiously. Andrew froze, his mind racing to connect the dots. Could this person be the reason the dog waited so patiently every night? As the figure drew closer, Andrew's breath caught in his throat. Whatever the truth was, he knew it was about to change everything. As the figure came closer, Andrew noticed they were moving with difficulty. The dim light revealed an older man, his clothes worn and dirty, his face etched with exhaustion. The puppy, Max, bolted toward him with an excitement that was almost heartbreaking. The man collapsed to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog, whispering something Andrew couldn't make out. It was clear now, Max wasn't just a stray. He belonged to this man. Andrew approached cautiously, his concern growing. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. The man looked up, startled at first, then nodded weakly. His hands trembled as he held on to Max, who seemed to be his only source of comfort. "I'm fine," the man muttered, but Andrew could see that wasn't true. The man's hollow cheeks and sunken eyes told a story of hardship, one Andrew was sure he couldn't fully grasp yet. "What's your name?" Andrew pressed, crouching down to meet his gaze. The man hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. "It's Joe," he finally said. "This little guy is all I've got left." His voice cracked, and Andrew felt a pang of guilt for every moment he'd ignored the puppy in the past few days. "Why have you been coming here, Joe?" Andrew asked, his tone kind but filled with curiosity. Joe looked away, his fingers brushing through Max's fur. "I wasn't trying to bother anyone," he said quietly. I needed to be close to her." Andrew's brow furrowed. Her, he repeated. Joe nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. My wife. She's inside. She's been here for weeks. I'm not allowed in to see her because I couldn't pay for the treatment she needed. His voice broke, and he swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground. They said I had to wait for updates outside. I didn't have anywhere else to go. So Max and we just stayed close. She's all I have, and I didn't want her to feel alone. Andrew's chest tightened. He'd worked in this hospital for years and had seen countless stories of struggle, but something about Joe's quiet desperation struck a nerve. He couldn't imagine the pain of being so close to someone you loved, yet unable to be there for them when they needed you most. Joe, Andrew said after a pause, why didn't you ask for help? Someone could've, he trailed off, realizing how hollow his words sounded. People like Joe often slipped through the cracks, unseen and unheard until it was too late. Joe let out a bitter laugh. Help? From who? People don't notice you when you're like me. I lost my job months ago, and after that, everything fell apart. Max kept me going, but it wasn't enough to stop my wife from getting sick. His voice was heavy with guilt, and Andrew could see how deeply he blamed himself. Before Andrew could respond, the hospital doors swung open, and a nurse stepped out. She stopped when she saw them, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. Dr. Lawson, she said, is everything all right? Andrew glanced at Joe, then back at the nurse. Can you check on a patient for me? I need information about Joe's wife. The nurse hesitated, then nodded, disappearing back inside. Joe looked panicked. What are you doing? He asked, clutching Max protectively. I don't want any trouble. Andrew shook his head. You're not in trouble, Joe. I just want to help. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. Max rested his head on Joe's lap, his tail thumping softly against the pavement. Finally, the nurse returned, her face somber. She handed Andrew a chart and whispered something in his ear. Whatever she said made Andrew's stomach drop. He turned to Joe, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We need to go inside, Joe. Your wife, she needs you now. Joe's eyes widened, and he scrambled to his feet, clutching Max tightly. What's happening? He asked, his voice shaking. Andrew didn't have the heart to answer. All he knew was that time was running out. Joe hesitated at the hospital doors, gripping Max as if letting go of the little dog would unravel him completely. Andrew placed a hand on his shoulder, sensing the man's fear. You're doing the right thing, Andrew said softly. Joe nodded but didn't move until Max nudged him forward with a gentle whine. Together, they stepped inside, the fluorescent lights harsh against the heavy atmosphere. The nurse led them to a quiet corridor where the steady beeping of machines echoed faintly. Wait here, she said, disappearing into a room at the far end. Joe paced nervously, his hands trembling as he clung to Max's collar. Andrew stood nearby, his mind racing. He didn't know what to expect, but he couldn't shake the gravity of the situation. Joe's story had stirred something in him, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how easily people could be overlooked. Minutes later, the nurse returned, her expression unreadable. Dr. Lawson, can I speak with you? She asked. Joe looked panicked, his voice rising. What's going on? Is she okay? The nurse hesitated, glancing between them. Andrew raised a hand to calm Joe. Stay here. I'll find out, he said firmly before following the nurse down the hall. Inside the room, Andrew saw a frail woman lying in the bed, her chest rising and falling with effort. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, and the monitors beeped steadily. The nurse handed him a chart, explaining her condition in hushed tones. It was bad, worse than he'd expected. She needed immediate intervention, but the odds were slim. Andrew felt a lump in his throat. How could he tell Joe? When Andrew returned, Joe was sitting on the floor, Max curled in his lap. He looked up, his eyes filled with fear. What did they say? Can I see her? Andrew crouched down to meet his gaze. Joe, he began carefully, your wife is in critical condition. She's been fighting hard, but she needs treatment you couldn't afford. He paused, choosing his words with care. I don't know how much time she has left. Joe's face crumpled, and a muffled sob escaped his lips. He buried his face in Max's fur, shaking as he cried. I failed her, he whispered. I failed her, and now it's too late. Andrew's heart ached at the sight. He wanted to say something, anything, that could ease Joe's pain, but no words felt right. Instead, he sat beside him, letting the silence stretch between them. After a while, Joe spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She always told me to keep going, no matter what. Even when we lost the house, even when I couldn't find work. She believed in me, even when I stopped believing in myself. He looked at Andrew, his eyes red and swollen. But how am I supposed to go on without her? Andrew felt a surge of anger, not at Joe, but at the system that had left him so powerless. He thought of the countless patients he'd seen who couldn't afford care, of the stories he'd heard but couldn't fix. He glanced at Max, who was staring up at Joe with an expression almost human in its empathy. Maybe it's not too late, Andrew said suddenly. If we can stabilize her, if we act now, there might still be a chance. Joe's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? How? Andrew hesitated. The hospital had strict policies, and bending the rules wasn't without risk. But looking at Joe and Max, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Leave it to me, he said finally. But you have to trust me. Joe nodded, clutching Max as if the dog were his lifeline. Andrew stood, determination hardening his resolve. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to let Joe face it alone. Andrew moved swiftly, the weight of his decision pressing on him with each step. He had no idea how this would end, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on Joe and his wife. Stopping at the nurse's station, he pulled aside a colleague he trusted, a young nurse named Clara, whose compassion often matched his own. In hushed tones, he explained the situation, carefully avoiding details that might raise questions. Clara's eyes widened as she listened, but she didn't hesitate. What do you need me to do? She asked. We need to stabilize her, Andrew said firmly. I'll pull some strings for temporary authorization, but this has to stay quiet. If anyone asks, it's an emergency protocol. Clara nodded, already moving to gather supplies. Andrew felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. He knew the hospital's bureaucracy wouldn't look kindly on this kind of decision. His career could be on the line. Meanwhile, Joe sat in the corridor, his hands gripping Max's collar so tightly his knuckles turned white. Max seemed to sense the tension, resting his head on Joe's lap and letting out a soft whine. Joe barely noticed the people walking past, the sounds of the hospital fading into a dull hum. All he could think about was his wife, how she had been his rock through everything, and how powerless he felt now. Andrew returned, his face serious but determined. Joe, we're doing everything we can. I've authorized immediate care, but we need to act fast. I can't promise anything, but we're not giving up. Joe looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Thank you, he whispered, his voice cracking. Thank you for not giving up on her. As Andrew headed back toward the room, he couldn't shake the image of Joe's desperation. It fueled him, pushing him to work faster, to find solutions where there seemed to be none. Clara joined him, helping to set up equipment and administer medications. The room was a flurry of activity, the steady beeping of monitors a constant reminder of how critical the situation was. Outside, Joe felt the minutes stretch into hours. He paced the corridor, his anxiety mounting with every passing second. Max followed him, his tail wagging weakly as if trying to reassure him. A few nurses offered kind smiles or words of encouragement, but none could answer the question burning in Joe's mind, would his wife survive? Suddenly, the doors to the room swung open, and Clara emerged, her expression tense. She approached Joe, her hands clasped tightly. We've stabilized her for now, she said softly. But it's touch and go. Dr. Lawson is doing everything he can, but this is a critical moment. Joe's knees buckled, and he sank into a nearby chair, Max jumping up beside him. He rubbed his hands over his face, trying to process the nurse's words. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a moment. But you need to be strong for her." Joe stood, his legs trembling as he followed Clara to the room. Inside, he saw his wife lying still, tubes and wires connecting her fragile body to the machines keeping her alive. His heart broke at the sight, but he pushed back his tears, knowing he needed to be strong for her. Max stayed by the door, as if sensing this moment was meant for Joe alone. Joe knelt by the bed, taking her hand gently in his. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I'm not leaving you. You're going to get through this, and we'll go home together." Her eyelids fluttered slightly, a faint sign of acknowledgement, and Joe clung to it as if it were a lifeline. In the hallway, Andrew watched through the small window in the door, his chest tight. He had done everything he could, but now it was out of his hands. The tension in the air was suffocating, each moment dragging like an eternity. All they could do now was wait. As Joe sat by his wife's bedside, her hand resting limply in his, the faintest trace of a smile flickered across her pale lips. It was so small that Joe almost missed it, but it sent a rush of hope surging through him. "You're still here with me," he whispered, his voice catching. Max sat obediently by the door, his eyes locked on Joe as if silently lending him strength. For a brief moment, it felt like the worst might finally be over. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the fragile quiet. Andrew burst into the room, his expression grim. "Joe, we have a problem," he said, his tone low but urgent. Joe looked up, alarmed. "What is it? What's happening?" Andrew hesitated, glancing at Joe's wife before stepping closer. "The hospital administration found out. Someone flagged the emergency authorization, and now they're questioning why we went ahead with the treatment without payment. They're threatening to stop everything unless we can justify it." Joe's heart sank, his grip tightening on his wife's hand. "You can't let them do that," he said, his voice rising in panic. "She's just starting to fight back. If they stop now," his words trailed off, the unspoken consequences too devastating to voice. Andrew's jaw tightened, his own frustration evident. "I'm doing everything I can, Joe, but I need more time. We need something, anything, that will convince them to keep going." Joe's mind raced, but he came up empty. He had no resources, no connections, nothing that could sway a system so indifferent to people like him. Just as despair began to take hold, a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Maybe there's another way," Clara said, stepping into the room. She looked at Andrew, then at Joe. "What about the charity fund? The one set aside for cases like this?" Andrew frowned, shaking his head. "That fund is almost gone, and the approval process could take days. We don't have that kind of time." Clara didn't back down. "Then we'll bypass the process. If we get enough signatures from staff, we can override the usual protocols. It's risky, but it might be our only shot." Andrew considered her words, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "It's a long shot," he admitted. "But it's better than nothing." Joe looked between them, desperation giving way to determination. "What can I do?" he asked. Andrew met his gaze, his voice firm. "You need to tell your story, Joe. We need people to understand why this matters, not just to you, but to all the patients who've been overlooked." Joe hesitated, his instinct to stay invisible warring with his need to save his wife. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes." Andrew and Clara sprang into action, rallying staff and drafting an emergency petition. Joe, meanwhile, stood in the main corridor, his voice trembling as he recounted his story to anyone who would listen. He spoke of the love he and his wife had shared, the struggles they'd faced, and the little dog who had kept them going when everything else fell apart. Max sat faithfully by his side, his presence a silent testament to the bond that had carried them through. At first, the response was lukewarm, with only a handful of staff stopping to sign. But as word spread, more people came forward, nurses, doctors, even patients, each moved by Joe's unwavering devotion. Slowly, the petition grew, and with it, the possibility of hope. Just as the last signature was being collected, a voice cut through the crowd. "What's all this about?" Everyone turned to see a man in a suit, his expression cold and calculating. It was the hospital's administrator. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Joe and Max. "I hope you realize this could cost people their jobs," he said sharply. Joe felt his stomach drop, but before he could respond, Andrew stepped forward. "And I hope you realize that saving a life is worth that risk," he said, his voice steady. The tension in the air was palpable as the administrator eyed the petition. For a moment, everything hung in the balance, the fate of Joe's wife teetering on the edge. The administrator stood silently, his eyes scanning the petition in Andrew's hand. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. Joe clutched Max's leash tightly, his knuckles white. Andrew, determined not to back down, spoke again. "These signatures aren't just names. They're people who believe in doing what's right. People who see the value in saving a life, regardless of the bottom line." Clara nodded in agreement, her presence a quiet but powerful show of solidarity. The administrator's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sharp exhale, he said, "Fine. Proceed with the treatment. But understand this, it's a one-time exception, and the paperwork had better be spotless." Relief swept through the room like a wave. Joe nearly collapsed, his legs weak with gratitude. He managed to stammer out a thank you, but the administrator was already walking away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Andrew wasted no time, rushing back to the ICU with Clara to oversee the next phase of care. Joe followed closely, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Max stayed by his side, his small presence a steadying force in the storm of emotions. Inside the room, the team worked tirelessly, adjusting medications and monitoring vital signs. Joe watched from the corner, silently willing his wife to fight. Hours passed in a blur of tension and exhaustion. Then, just as dawn began to break, the first signs of change appeared. Joe's wife stirred, her eyelids fluttering open for the first time in days. "Joe," she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable. Joe rushed to her side, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm right here." The room filled with quiet cheers from the staff as Joe held her hand, overwhelmed with relief. Andrew stood nearby, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't over, there was still a long road to recovery, but this was a victory, a moment that made all the risks and sleepless nights worth it. But just as the relief began to settle in, a nurse entered the room, her face pale. She handed Andrew a note, her hands trembling slightly. "This was left at the front desk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew unfolded the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the short, cryptic message, "You can't save everyone. Remember that." Andrew's stomach turned. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no signature, but the words felt heavy with intent. He glanced at Joe and his wife, who were too caught up in their reunion to notice. For their sake, Andrew kept the note to himself, slipping it into his pocket. He didn't know who had written it or why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As the sun rose higher, bathing the hospital in warm light, life slowly returned to normal. Joe's wife was stable, and plans for her long-term care were being arranged. Joe sat by her side, Max curled at their feet, a picture of quiet contentment. But Andrew couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the back of his mind. He knew they had won this battle, but the war, whatever it was, might still be waiting. As Andrew walked down the corridor, the note weighed heavily in his pocket, a reminder that even in moments of triumph, shadows could still lurk just out of sight. The days following his wife's awakening felt like a blur to Joe. The hospital became a second home as he remained by her side, watching her grow stronger with each passing day. The doctors continued her treatment, and though progress was slow, it was steady. Each small milestone, a smile, a word, the first time she moved her hand, felt like a victory worth celebrating. Max stayed close, lying by her bed as if he understood the role he had played in her survival. Andrew made regular visits to check on her condition. Each time he saw Joe, there was a quiet exchange of gratitude. For Joe, Andrew was more than just a doctor, he was the reason his family had been given a second chance. For Andrew, seeing her recovery reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place. The note, however, still haunted him. He hadn't shared it with anyone, unsure if it was a warning or just someone's misguided way of making a point. One evening, Joe found himself sitting by his wife's bed as she slept peacefully. He reached down to stroke Max's fur, his thoughts heavy. "You saved us, boy," he murmured. Max looked up at him, wagging his tail gently. Joe's mind wandered to the months they had spent in uncertainty, the nights Max had kept watch outside the hospital, and the hope the little dog had brought when everything seemed lost. The following week, Joe's wife was discharged, a moment that felt almost surreal. The hospital staff gathered to say goodbye, and even the usually stoic administrator offered a few kind words. Clara handed Joe a small envelope. "For the dog who brought us all together," she said with a smile. Inside was a certificate for a year's worth of free checkups and food for Max at a local vet clinic. Joe laughed through tears, shaking her hand as he thanked her. Back at home, life began to settle into a new normal. Joe's wife continued her recovery, leaning on both him and Max for support. Max seemed to sense her needs, staying close and offering his gentle presence whenever she seemed overwhelmed. Joe started volunteering at a local animal shelter, inspired by Max's loyalty and the way one small dog had changed their lives. He wanted to give back, to help other animals find the kind of connection Max had brought into their family. One afternoon, Andrew stopped by to check on Joe and his wife. As they chatted over coffee, Joe finally worked up the courage to ask, "What's been bothering you, Doc? I can tell something's been on your mind." Andrew hesitated, then pulled the folded note from his pocket. He handed it to Joe, watching his reaction closely. Joe read it, his brow furrowing. "What do you think it means?" he asked. Andrew shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe it was just someone trying to remind me that I can't save everyone. Or maybe it was something more. Either way, I don't want it to overshadow what we accomplished." Joe nodded, handing the note back. "You didn't just save her, Andrew. You saved me, too. And no note can take that away." As the weeks turned into months, the memory of the note faded, replaced by the joys of recovery and the simple pleasures of everyday life. Joe's wife grew stronger, and their little family, Joe, his wife, and Max, found a rhythm again. The bond between them felt unshakable, forged in the fire of their struggles. Max, ever the loyal companion, remained at the heart of it all. On warm evenings, he'd lay on the porch with Joe, watching the sun set over the horizon. Joe would often find himself reflecting on everything they'd been through, the challenges, the fears, and the unexpected kindness of strangers who had become friends. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving, it was about the love that carried them through. Life didn't return to exactly what it had been, but maybe that was the point. It became something better, shaped by resilience, compassion, and the unwavering loyalty of a little dog who never gave up.